want to finish talking about Spanish and French colonial enterprise in the New World. To recap the Spanish colonial enterprise, this is a vast territory from what is now San Francisco, California to the tip of South America. This is a huge area, and it is essentially a crown enterprise. By that I mean it is sponsored officially by the government of Spain. And because of that, the army is involved, the church, the Jesuit order primarily, is involved in colonizing and establishing colonies over this vast territory. And because of the inability of the central administration to be on the scene, it meant that they had to actually write laws and rules by which these colonies would operate, both in terms of how they would be set up and governed, so on and so forth. These were called the Laws of the Indies in 1573 was when they were passed, after the fact. Once they got into it, they realized that they needed a law, a code, that everyone would follow. And as a result, you have this sort of fair uniformity across these three types of Spanish colonial settlements: the presidio, which was military; the pueblo, which was administrative and domestic; and the mission, which was either independent or often in association with the other two. The French colonial enterprise is a little bit different, although eventually it will sort of morph into something that resembles the Spanish colonial enterprise. The third major group, the British, the English colonies are entirely different, and we will focus on those in greater detail both today and in the next lecture on Monday. So today I want to talk about the French colonial enterprise in the New World. There's an aspect of this that has a lot to do with sort of pure just competition, economic competition. Once the Spanish, the French, and the English are all in competition with one another, sort of in a way like cities would be today, trying to promote economic development, trying to attract a Super Bowl, trying to, we talked about the Olympics earlier and so forth, to sort of put yourself on the global stage, so to speak, but also so that you can't let the other guys get a sort of unfair advantage, in a sense. Not unfair, but at least corner the market. And so the French got into the act, but they got into the act late. And by that I mean that the original French settlements were actually not crown controlled. They were fishermen, following the very rich North Atlantic schools of fish, primarily cod, mostly off the northern coast of France. And they followed these, and eventually they bumped into the St. Lawrence Riverway that we see up here at the top, shaded in yellow. Following that huge sort of mouth of that river, eventually you come to the Great Lakes. And if you skip over a small amount of land about where Chicago is now on the shore of Lake Michigan there, you'll hit the Mississippi. And once you hit the Mississippi, it's a straight shot to the Gulf of Mexico. Originally, these fishermen simply set up summer camps. And since the winters are very, very, very harsh in what is now Canada and upstate New York and Maine and Newfoundland and these places, they actually would pack up and leave when the weather got bad, only to return the next year. There was obviously at some point, as the fishing proved to be economically viable, there was a point where the infrastructure required to set up these camps and break these camps became substantial, and so they began to settle permanently, and they intermarried with the indigenous population. It was only later that the French, around 1700, that the French crown would actually get involved, sort of trying to establish then permanent settlements in which these traditional forms of authority, the state, the church, and so forth, would actually come into the picture. The theory was that if you could control, or it's difficult for us to imagine this, but they didn't know, you couldn't make a map like this in 1700. It's fascinating if you go to the Villa Farnese at Caprarola in Tuscany today. There's a huge sort of ballroom salon that is called the map room because it's a map of the world. And the Farneses were a very powerful, wealthy family. Several of them became popes and so forth. And it's a fascinating room to look at these maps. One is, it's clear they thought they were the masters of the universe. But second, there are certain things on these maps that don't exist. Like Australia doesn't exist because nobody had run into it. Now, clearly there were people living there. They knew it was there, right? But let's just say that the Italians or the French or the Spanish or these European courts were not aware of it. And to look at maps of North America in particular, because actually South America, ironically, was settled from the west to the east. It came into here and down the coast and then across into what is now Argentina. Portugal settled Brazil from the east coast, but in other words, they could sort of map the coastline of South America. But North America, in particular, the area from sort of about where it says Jesuit Mission west up towards Santa Fe is just really vague. You know, Florida's really big. The Great Lakes are about, in scale, 30 miles from Florida. You know, I mean, they sort of didn't know what was out there. And so the idea was that if you could control the interior of this landmass, you then would have an advantage. And so if you could build colonies here that would go up the Mississippi and all the way out to the ocean here, then you basically had secured the entire continent. This proved not to be sustainable. And eventually the land was sold to the fledgling government of the United States at the end of the beginning of the 19th century in 1803, I believe, somewhere along in there. The English came in later. Actually, they were earlier than 1700, came in here at 1620 at Jamestown and 1630 in New England. But the English colonies were entirely different because, remember, by 1630, they had cut the head off their king. So there was not a sort of the Reformation of the church, the separation from Rome, all of these things had already happened. And so the result was that the English colonies are really quite different than either the Spanish or the French. And that becomes actually important in keeping in mind that though we are speaking English now, so in North America, that was sort of the European cultural influence that sort of won out, so to speak. We inherit all three of these traditions. And to this, I want to add a fourth. I don't want to get too involved in the African slave trade, but it really begins in 1704. And it ends in 1833. But there is an infusion of African culture in the Americas that is simply absent in the Old World. I mean, it's just absent. Now, just like the English or the French or the Spanish, that doesn't mean that you have these sort of lock, stock, and barrel. I mean, these people had they had no government, they had no army, they had nothing, behind them like that. But in American culture, as we'll see at the very end today, I think it's important to understand that there's this deep, deep, deep infusion of African culture into the Americas, particularly in the Caribbean and South America, but also in North America. It is impossible, I'm going to skip to the last slide now, but I'm going to say this now. It is impossible to imagine something like jazz or rock and roll could ever have come fully blown out of Europe. Ever. Right? It is impossible. How many of you enjoy Louisiana cuisine, like gumbo? right? You like gumbo? That's a West African word for okra. All right. So if you begin to dig, what you discover is that there's all of this stuff that is deeply embedded in the DNA of the New World that is from Africa, even though clearly they were not one of these European colonial powers. Now, I mention this because today we'll focus first on the French, and then we'll move to the two of the English cultural hearts that have influence. And I want to focus here on Louisiana, which was fairly late in the French colonial enterprise, but again, they were trying to control the mouth of the Mississippi. Now, the Mississippi Delta, and by that I mean the geologic delta, not the part of Mississippi, the state that is, but it was a very complex river system, one that is still not fully understood, even from an engineering standpoint. It's very, very difficult. As we saw with Katrina, I mean, it's very difficult to control this river that actually is draining a third of a continent. It's a huge thing. I mean, the Ohio and the Missouri and all of these that come into it. But so you couldn't build down in here because this is all sort of swamp and bayou, and good French word for swamp. And so they tried to settle initially on the bluffs overlooking the river so that they controlled the entry up. The first of these was Baton Rouge, which is means red stick, which is the capital of Louisiana today. And second, on the heels of that, was Natchez. And there were two settlements in Natchez. It takes its name from the indigenous population that lived there, who burned the first settlement to the ground, and then ultimately a second one was built slightly upriver, I mean a few hundred yards upriver on a bluff overlooking the Mississippi. And then with those two in place, they were then able to secure the actual entry point here between Lake Pontchartrain and the river, and that would be Nouvelle Orleans, or New Orleans. Now, interestingly enough, New Orleans was laid out in 1717 by a man who was 22 years old. His commanding officer in the French army had died, and he was a lieutenant in his first commission, and his name was Bienville, which in French means Bienville, which means good town. I think that's great, good town. That was his name. And Bienville laid out New Orleans. Now, when you look at New Orleans or St. Louis or Des Moines or any of these French colonial enterprises, you will see a remarkable resemblance to the Spanish. Is this because the French were also subject to the Spanish law of the Indies? No. Why do you think they would bear a remarkable similarity? They're both based on the same precedents, those ideas that had come up out of the Italian Renaissance, these treatises on the ideal city. In other words, they were all reading the same books. Okay? That's very important. Well, if we look then at New Orleans, what we see is built on a bluff. Actually, during Katrina, the original part here did not flood. It's on a very, very low-lying bluff. And because of natural sedimentation and the foolishness of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, who in the 19th century began to construct levees to try to control the flooding, the problem is that the bottom of the river is now higher than the city. So if you're in New Orleans, you actually have to pump all of your stormwater, for example, up and out into the river because the river is actually higher than the city. This is a major problem, and sooner or later that river is going to win out. I don't know when, but it will because it always has. So when we look at this, what we see then are the first feature is this, which is a canal that was intended to be constructed that would provide a connection between Lake Pontchartrain and the Mississippi, so that in case the Spanish or the English or heaven knows somebody else came up the river with gunboats blazing. They sort of had a backdoor exit out to Lake Pontchartrain. This canal was never built, but a huge street would be constructed in its alignment here, which is still there, called Canal Street. Very, very wide street. The second then is that there's a fort that's constructed here on the downriver side, so that if you're coming up river this way, you could secure it down at this end. The markets then develop right in here. The central feature is this Place d'Armes, Plaza Mayor in the Spanish, but in French, Place d'Armes, which was this sort of place that we see here with the Church of Saint Louis at the head of it. And then here, the sort of things associated with the church. This is actually the jail and the administrative headquarters. And then over here, things that were associated with the church. And then markets that were built along down in here. Regularized blocks that we see using the, at the time, the French equivalent of the old Roman system. Now let me pause for a moment and talk about measure, because the metric system, which the whole world, except for the United States, is on, is a product of the French Revolution, because it's based on the base 10 divisions of the circumference of the earth. Now, what are feet and inches based on? Body parts, right? See that foot right there? That's exactly one English foot. Roman foot was 11.87 inches. Had smaller feet, I guess. But it was based on body parts. And if you go back and read a lot of Roman literature, you'll see references to things, to terms like the foot of Drusus, right? So in the French Revolution, they changed it to the metric system to it's a shift in authority. The earth, circumference of the earth becomes the authority, not the body of the king. You follow me? All right. So had the United States been formed 2 decades earlier, we would be on the metric system too, and we would not be using feet and inches and miles, which is essentially descended from the Roman system. Okay? More on that later. But it's significant because this is laid out on the French equivalent to feet and inches, and that is the toise, T-O-I-S-E. And I don't know right now, and it's really not that important, exactly what the equivalent in meters or in feet would be for a toise, but it's funny when you read these old documents, because it refers to 14 toises or 8 toises. You say, what is a toise? T-O-I-S-E. So this was laid out then in these kind of square blocks. Now let me say, for the urban design students in here in particular, square blocks are very difficult to deal with. And you'll notice they had problems with it. They had problems because they had to insert another block in the middle here, lots in the middle. They could have let these go all the way through. And we'll see in Savannah how, based on that system that developed in London of the terrace house and the Mews, how the insertion of the alley made a big difference in how the city evolved and developed economically over time within the colonial framework that was laid down in 1733. But here they did not have alleys. They actually created this, they inserted these lots into the center of that, and ultimately that can create problems over time because it sort of shortchanges this. I mean, to do anything with this block, to build this building, for example, you would have to acquire this property, and it sort of creates a lot of problems. Plus, even if you don't need that lot, you end up then, what does that lot become, right? Because the dimensions of it are such that it limits the building types that can go in there, right? That's a sort of principal thing. So blocks that are biased in one direction dimensionally generally are better than blocks that are square. And that's sort of a universal rule, okay, for everybody, every architect, every urban designer, every city planner in existence. So while this resembles the laws of the Indies, in fact, it's coming from the same sources, but not subject to the laws of the Indies. Well, over time, As I said, the canal was never built, and this broad street in the part that was originally the French colonial part, today known as the French Quarter or the Vieux Carré, separated here from what is now called the American sector, still to this day. After the Louisiana Purchase, Louisiana came into the possession, all the French colonial stuff all the way up to the Great Lakes became part of the fledgling United States, became territory attached to the United States, and thus this is still referred to today as the American sector. And if we look at that, we can see then Canal Street here going back to Rampart Street over here and Basin Street that we see here. Originally, again, this was intended to be a canal that would open up to Lake Pontchartrain to provide a sort of backdoor escape route in case of attack. Eventually, as the United States began to grow in the 19th century, and New Orleans became a very important port for obvious reasons, you began to get these additions that were added on, sort of suburbs that were added on following the river. And you'll notice here the sort of interesting adherence to these. Here they've gone away from the square block, and now you've got a block that's clearly biased in this direction rather than that direction, and that's interesting. More on that when we come to Manhattan. And you'll see these kind of peculiarities where ultimately the river is curving, and so this is rotated around. And when we come to Atlanta at the very end, we'll talk about some similar things, not following the river, but following the railroad lines, following the railroad tracks, which is why downtown Atlanta has all these rotated grids. Well, here is the Place d'Armes today, and the Église Saint-Louis, and our statue of our friend Marcus Aurelius, who is now actually Andrew Jackson, the guy on the $20 bill, for those of you who don't know. And he was involved in the War of 1812 with the British. And even though the war was over, there was a battle that was fought here, the Battle of New Orleans, and ultimately the Americans won, although the war was already over. The treaty had been signed. They just didn't have email and so forth at the time. It's an old photograph, but New Orleans is often referred to, I've heard people refer to it as the most European of all American cities. I don't think so. I think it's the most American of all American cities, because it really is this agglomeration of all these colonial and African influences and Caribbean influences that are actually mixed together in a way so that it creates and forms its kind of its own world, its own sort of unique culture. So we have this Georgian British architecture, we have French colonial architecture, we have Spanish colonial architecture as well, because it actually was part of New Spain for several decades, actually, and for a long time. And it actually has a lot of Spanish colonial influence in it as well. The housing is really of two types. The first is this sort of French colonial type that we see here, this kind of single-family house opening directly to the street. This overhang, this little detail right here, together with this sort of second porch that we see here. Actually, Richard Dozier at Tuskegee, who's dean at Tuskegee, wrote an article when he was at Yale on the West African influence on this and this colonial French architecture in the Mississippi Delta. And I think he's right. I think this is actually has some African influence built into it. Now, I'm not saying this to be politically correct. Let me just, again, a sidebar. Down on the coast of Georgia, anybody here from Brunswick, Savannah, Brunswick? You know what tabby is? All right, tabby is all over from Jacksonville north to South Carolina. It is concrete. What? It's concrete. There isn't any concrete anywhere in Europe except for the Dome of the Pantheon, because by the 7th century they had forgotten how to make concrete. But there it is, going back to the 18th century on the Georgia coast. What's it doing there? How did it get there? Well, we don't know. But we can attack that question a number of ways. I wrote a paper on this. So. One is to look at it etymologically. It comes from an Arabic word, tapi, which is an archaic word, no longer in use, which meant cement or cement house. Tapi. It first appears in the English colonies in the South after the War of Jenkins' Ear, which is where this English captain was trying to provoke a war with Spain in what is now around Brunswick, Georgia, 1715. And he actually cut his ear off and mailed it to his commanding officer, saying that he had been captured by the Spanish. Cut his own ear off and mailed it to his commanding officer, saying he had been taken prisoner, and whatever the code, the Geneva Convention equivalent was at that point in time, that was considered grounds for war. And so the war broke out, and the Spanish were not particularly interested in Florida anyway. It's mostly a sandbar, and what's not a sandbar is underwater. And they didn't have any stone, and they really sort of weren't all that serious about it, I think. Once they figured out there wasn't, Ponce de Leon Springs was not, the Fountain of Youth and all that was not there, they kind of gave up. Well, anyway, St. Augustine was sacked by the British in 1715, and the first use of tabby was at the Castillo de San Marcos as a flooring material in the Presidio of St. Augustine in Florida. That's the first use that we know of. All right, that's one way, so it's this Arabic word. Well, that would indicate what? That it's coming from North Africa, probably. So let's assume there was Roman concrete still today all over Morocco, Mauritania, Algeria, Tunisia. You'll see huge amphitheaters and all kinds of things out in the middle of nowhere in some cases. So let's assume, here we have to speculate, that the knowledge of how to make this stuff actually came into, if it's in Mauritania, why would it not then travel further south into Sierra Leone, one of the exit ports of the Spanish slave trade, the biggest one actually, going from there to the Canary Islands and into the Caribbean? And why then would it not have been brought to the New World by people who had knowledge of how to make this? The Spanish didn't know how to make concrete. Why not? Because concrete requires ash as a catalytic agent. And the Romans had that built in because pozzolana was actually a volcanic material, volcanic sand, that actually already had the ash in it. Brunelleschi never could figure out how to get it set up. He never could make it work. So what did they do? There are no rocks. There are no stone for aggregates in Florida. So what did they use in tabby? Do you know? Yeah. Oyster shells. Oyster shells. And where did they get the lime? By burning the oyster shells. And what happens when you burn oyster shells? You get ash. So if you mix the lime from the burned oyster shell that already has the ash in the mix with water and sand, it will set up like concrete. It's the same thing, and you're using the shell itself as the aggregate. Over here on Marietta Street, in what is now it used to be the Advanced Wood Products Lab, College of Architecture has, it's now the Digital Fabrication Lab in the GTRI shop. We were adding on to that building, and we were putting in the footings and the foundations in the back, and we were digging, and guess what we found? Oyster shell. We're pretty far from the coast, are we not? All right, well, this is before they had figured out how to actually quarry granite out of Stone Mountain. So the crushed aggregates that you would get today that are mostly granite didn't exist. So the only aggregates they had for the concrete was oyster shell. So we can imagine that certain kinds of materials that are available here that are not available in Savannah or in Brunswick, for example, are being moved back and forth, vice versa, right, by rail car. And there, off of Marietta Street, between Marietta Street and the railroad going to Chattanooga, was in fact this cache of oyster shells. I have one of them sitting on my desk at home. It's amazing, absolutely amazing. Well, so I believe tabby concrete actually came in from Africa. So I'm not just saying this, as I said, to be sort of up to date or something. I mean, I actually think this is like that. Well, the second type was actually the old Roman insula type, which has sort of been revived at some point, particularly in Spain and still exists in North Africa, and the French in the 19th century will actually adopt it for the Parisian apartment block. The difference, of course, is that here you're opening directly onto the street. Here you're entering into a courtyard, and then you're distributed both on the ground floor, which is given over to quartering of horses and other kinds of things associated with work, and then the living is upstairs. So even today, if you go to a hotel or something in the French Quarter, oftentimes your bedroom will open out to the street, right? You're actually distributed from the interior of the building up and out. This is Preservation Hall, of course, a very famous place associated with the birth of jazz. Canal Street. This area in the center that's now a sort of rubber-tired streetcar, this very, very wide street. This was supposed to be the canal. This is Vieux Carré over here. This is the so-called American sector over here. This zone in the middle has a name. Does anyone know what that is? It says it up here. It's called the neutral territory or the neutral zone. Why? Well, when the English-speaking people came in after the Louisiana Purchase over here, they could not stand the people over here. And the people over here really could not stand the people over here. They didn't get along. And so they had to meet in a public place. Now, most of these people were Protestant Christians, and most of these people were Roman Catholics. Right? So where do you think they met? In the Church of St. Louis? No. They met in the neutral zone, which is why it's actually called that. And again, this is something that I think is different about American urbanism, and that is that the street plays a role historically as public space in a way that is very different than it did before, because the Place d'Armes was associated with a particular form of authority, whereas the street was considered to be neutral. And thus the territory, the name, still remains. Well, I'll meet you at the neutral zone, in the neutral zone at the neutral territory at noon for lunch, still to this day. Now, I mentioned this earlier, and I just want to point this out because I don't want to put too fine a point on it, but here we have on a Saturday afternoon in 1980, they've closed off the Rue Royale down in the French Quarter, and I was walking along with my old Micromat 35 millimeter camera, and I ran across these musicians who had kind of set up in the middle of the street, and they were really good, and they had attracted a crowd. And so here we have a man of African descent playing an Italian instrument, and a man who looks like he's perhaps of Irish descent playing an African instrument, and then some guy who looks like he's a refugee from the high school band over here playing this instrument, this tuba, or sometimes something similar is called a French horn. You get my point, right? That this is a unique mix and blend of things that did not and could not have happened anywhere in the old world. But in the colonial world, it is a world like, it's a house of mirrors. You know, it's like when you look at it, it looks like it's you, but it's really not. You know, you're actually over there somewhere. Or something where your clothes have all been turned inside out. Everything is all mixed together in a unique way. And eventually, over time, whether it's food or music or architecture or anything else, it actually blends together and it grows legs, and it creates its own culture. And I'm convinced that music is the North American contribution to the world. It could not have happened anywhere else. The next time you eat paella and red beans and rice and things like that, I mean, they're really, really the same thing. All right. Well, now I mentioned the English are very different, and for those of you who from China or somewhere else, and for those of you who fell asleep during your high school history, this territory is unexplored and unmapped, right? This is New France. Everything to the south here is New Spain, except for Brazil, which is Portuguese. And then the English settle in here along the east coast. But unlike the Spanish and unlike the French, these are smaller groups of people who have simply received permission from the Crown. Permission. It's like you, a group of students who say, we want to enter this competition somewhere, Urban Land Institute competition or something, and you go to the school chair and you say, do we have permission to enter this, and will you give us $100 or something, right? And they say, yes, sometimes. And you kind of go out and do it on your own, right? Maybe with some faculty supervision, but basically you're on your own. New England, which is up here, what's now Connecticut, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, is very much that way. It was settled by a group of people called Puritans, and these people were on the extreme fringe of the Protestant movement. I mean extreme. I say this only slightly tongue-in-cheek. They were the Taliban of the Protestant movement, right? Now, the Puritans in England, you understand, were quite prominent. John Milton, who wrote Paradise Lost, Puritan. But these were the people who thought those guys were corrupt, all right? Now, what the difference is, and the importance of this is, that means that these people had no intention of having any relationship with the mother country whatsoever once they left. They were on their own, right? We're leaving, and we're not coming back. Now, that is very different from the Spanish or the French, particularly the Spanish, who said, we're here, we're going to grow crops, we're going to mine gold, we're going to do something, we're sending it back, right? Here, these people said, we don't want to have anything to do with those guys. They're corrupt. And we want to show what it's like to create and form a society that is based solely on one thing, the Bible. Now, it turns out that the Old Testament is a very good thing to tell you what you can eat on Tuesday. But it doesn't tell you very much about how to set up traffic signals, right? Or something like that. Or there's other aspects of governing creation of the Federal Aviation Administration to keep all the planes running, etc. Those kinds of things, tort law, Roman tort law, and so forth. And eventually, the whole sort of Puritan experiment in New England collapsed within about 100 years, completely. No more Puritans are left. They don't exist anymore. Gone. All right? But they were very different from the people who settled in the mid-Atlantic states here, particularly Pennsylvania. William Penn, who received a charter, was an intellectual. He was a lawyer. He was living at Lincoln's Inn. He had read all of the treatises on the ideal city. He believed that people were intrinsically good, regardless of their ethnicity or their individual differences of religion and so forth, and thus he wanted to create a city where everybody could come together, where its administration was autonomous of any particular group. So unlike the French, for example, where I said they had to go meet in the street because you're not going to get those Protestants over there to meet in that Catholic church, all right? That's just not going to happen. But in fact, the Penn had this idealized romantic notion that all these people could sort of all live together. Most of the people who came and settled in Philadelphia, it means brotherly love, right? And it actually, most of the people who settled there were German. They couldn't speak English. There was sort of nobody in charge, and it kind of went its own way. And we'll sort of tease that out here in a moment. And then the third set of colonies here in the Carolinas, Virginia, to the south is a little more complex, and we'll deal with that later. They really had no cities. I mean, there was a port of Charleston. Savannah comes in fairly late, 1733, 1734. There are a few inland ports like Richmond, but there really aren't any. And the South is really split into two cultural hearths. One is the Tidewater, which is associated directly with this area that you see. In fact, you can see it from the satellite photograph coming up right here, coming up the coast from Columbus, Georgia, to Macon, Georgia, to Augusta, Georgia, to Columbia, South Carolina, to Raleigh, North Carolina, to Richmond, Virginia. And that is where the old crystalline metamorphic rocks hit the coastal plain, right? So this is where you run out of rock, right here. This used to be the Atlantic Ocean, and the Gulf of Mexico used to come all the way up into what is now the Great Lakes. We are on some of the oldest, right here, the oldest land, geologically speaking, on Earth, Precambrian, very old. And most of what is here, used to be here, is now Florida, right? I mean, it all sort of washed down the rivers and eroded away. So the Atlantic South is quite different in that it's really split into two sort of divisions. The accents are different. If you're up here in the hills, you'll hear people pronounce the vowel I, or if you're European, E. That's an I, as a flat vowel sound. Bright, white, nice, right? As opposed to white, nice, bright. It's a flat sound. If you go down to Charleston and you pronounce C-O-O-P-E-R, which is one of the main rivers that flows through there, as Cooper, as I would, they will correct you. It's not Cooper, it's Cooper. It's the Cooper River. Cooper River. I used to laugh at the coach at the University of Georgia, Vince Dooley, because he always talked about the receivers. You know, we got to get the ball to the receivers. I always thought that was kind of funny. It's almost, it has an H in it. And you still hear this today. Every once in a while you hear Steve French, who grew up down here near Jamestown, actually, in Virginia, and he will say, hoose. Hoose. There's an oot, H-O-U. There's hoot, you know, every once in a while. Steve French is the Dean of the College of Architecture. But the more important difference here in this Tidewater region is that this was settled by people who received, like Lord Baltimore, who received grants from the Crown to engage directly in a colonial enterprise. By that I mean we're going to go there, we're going to grow crops, whatever it is, eventually tobacco, cotton, rice, whatever, that we can't grow in the old world, and we're actually going to then ship it back. Cotton becomes, of course, the big one. And that will fuel the textile mills in England, which will create the city of the dreadful night in the 19th century. Very different. So there are no cities to speak of other than these few ports. You have these long, you can see them, long navigable rivers. That's the Altamaha, that's the Savannah, that's the Cooper, the James, and so forth, which were long and navigable. And so these plantations were autonomous units built by wealthy people in direct import-export with the old world. You follow me? The boat comes from England. The boat sails up the river. The boat lands at your dock, right? And you load the cotton on the boat, and it takes off. Okay? Now, if you're, so you didn't have any manufacturing. You didn't have brick. You didn't have metal. So you had to import all of the building materials and so forth into the South. And it won't be Atlanta, for example, railroad city, Birmingham, 1871. These are late and not part of the colonial experience. So these are the three main sort of cultural hearths of these English colonies, and they will kind of move across and eventually mix in with the Spanish and the French elements, carrying a lot of the embedded African DNA, so to speak, with it. Just so you can see that, it's called the fall line, which is this geologic, it happens just south of Macon, and you really can see it when you experience it if you know what to look for. All right, today we will talk about New England, and I don't think we're going to get to Philadelphia, but we'll hold that for next week. Well, these Puritans, these people who settled in New England, going back to 1630, basically were accustomed to these small villages. This is from A.E.J. Morris, and this is showing what he calls organic growth towns that developed out in these fields that were owned by nobility. And it became, when they secured enough territory geographically, became more efficient to have people live in the fields near where they worked, rather than coming back into the city, into the burg, every night. And this is how they actually, this is what they brought with them. And that's how they laid out their towns. Now, they had on the good ship Arabella drawn up a compact that said that we will create townships. We don't have townships here. Louisiana, by the way, still has what? Parishes, right? It's different. The state law in Louisiana is still under Napoleonic code. It's amazing. Well, basically, everybody got a town lot around a common. The common was then where you actually would graze your cow, and typically it was associated with water because it was the only place you had grass. The whole eastern half of the what's now the United States is actually forest, and grass does not grow in the forest. So the most valuable thing they had was grassland, where they could actually get feed for the cattle, for their milk cows. And so you would own your cow, you had a garden plot in the back for your house, and then you would take your cow down to the stockman. This would be fenced about, and then you would leave the cow there, and then you would be assigned to go work in a common field outside. There were no roads that connected these townships one to the other, and when they reached a certain target population, usually of about 60 families, they would then, like the Greeks, send a colony of the younger people out further west to establish a new town. And if you drive from Boston, Massachusetts today across to the Connecticut Valley in western Massachusetts, you will see the evolution of this over about a 150 year period, so that beginning in 1630, by 1730, there are no more Puritans, and the whole thing has dissolved into something else. Nonetheless, this is very important in the history of North American urbanism, because I think that this becomes, in the industrial period, idealized as a kind of pre-industrial residential condition, and we see it in the form, influencing the form of the planned garden suburb. Right? So if you go up here to Ansley Park or Druid Hills or Brookwood Hills or Inman Park, what you're seeing in a sense is something that's derived from this idealized version of these New England Puritan townships. Politically, it's very unusual because there's no unincorporated territory in Massachusetts. There are 356 townships. So like a stained glass window or something, a patchwork quilt, everything is contiguous. Every boundary is contiguous. So a county, whereas Fulton County here has its own school system, fire department, so on, a county in New England is only a judicial district, right? It is not something that actually runs a government like a municipal government like Fulton County does here. So even today, politically, it's very, very different. And so you had these kind of fields. You would call away for a miller, or somebody who knew how to make grain or something. And here we see then the core of this here with these house lots, with the meeting house usually in a prominent place, and then these roads that went out to the fields that were held in common. Now, in the medieval world, this would have been owned by a landlord, right? By a duke or a duchess or a count or somebody. But here it's owned by this collective covenanted community that is attempting to live only by the Bible. Right? Eventually they sent away for law books and so forth because, as I said, if you try to extract what happens when a tree falls on your house or neighbor's house or something, or it's pretty hard to pull out of Deuteronomy. Well, here's the most valuable thing, where you had these old glacial ponds, grasses, and you could harvest this grass and feed the cows. This was extremely valuable. But unlike the Spanish in Florida, the English, Northern European, understood what to do with this. In other words, it was wood. So they had a tradition of wood architecture, and they could build things out of wood. They didn't need stone. Winters were much colder. There were no, if you look at this, actually there are very few roads at all that connect these towns. They were not only not interested in connecting back to the mother country, they were not interested in connecting to one another. They were intended to be completely autonomous as John Winthrop said, we shall be a city upon a hill. Well, the only time the roads between towns were passable was in the wintertime. In fact, as late as 1730, there's actually a law passed in New Hampshire limiting the size of the stumps in the roads to 3 feet. Think about that for a minute. 3 feet, right? You can't drive a car, or, of course they didn't have cars, but a horse and buggy over something that had 3-foot stumps in it. So the only time these roads were passable were in the wintertime. The winters were much colder. You needed about 10 acres of wood to get you through the winter, to burn it. And when we go there today, we see these sort of pre-industrial places that are quite beautiful. Maple leaves everywhere, maple trees, quite beautiful. But this is what it looked like in about 1820. This is after these pattern books. This is wood, by the way, not stone. These pattern books had come in, and it had been all these sort of, any farmer that had any sense had gotten out of New England and gone to Ohio by this time. And rural New England goes into a fairly substantial economic decline. But there's a point to this that I want to emphasize, and that is, look at this, the way these buildings meet the common space. They just simply sit on it. Well, boom. There's no intermediary architecture at all. It's just sitting there like it fell out of the sky or something. The original ones look like this. They didn't have paint, so they had to extract pine rosin to try to creosote to try to keep the wood from rotting. Keeping warm in the winter was incredibly important, and you didn't have glass. Glass was very, very difficult to make, and you had these tiny little panes of glass. This is the Cooper Frost Austin House. It was 2 blocks up the street from where I lived in Cambridge, Massachusetts. So when we see Lexington Common today, we have this image of these sort of pretty little girls in crinoline dresses running around on the 4th of July. That's not what it was like. It was actually, all these buildings would have looked more like that as they grouped around that common. By the way, all of the vegetation that you see here, all the evergreen elements here are actually imported. That is deodara cedar, which comes from Morocco. The reason I think it's important, this is Riverside, Illinois, planned garden suburb by Olmsted and Vaux, 1869, outside of Chicago. And if we study this, and we'll do that in a little bit greater detail later, we will see, in fact, that I think that the ideas here are really sort of derived from this kind of pre-industrial village of people joined together in common interests around common. If we actually look at the name of this street, it's called Long Common Road. These are called commons, etc., etc. And I'm struck even today how deep in Georgia this mythology associated, it's derived from these Puritan townships, are still with us. This is Ansley Park, just up the road, built in 1904. Sugar maples, vegetation that's not indigenous necessarily to the Georgia Piedmont, sort of colonial style wooden architecture sitting down in relation to the common area. We will suspend this today, and we'll try to get caught up with the mid-Atlantic states as the second of these English cultural hearts, because there's an urban tradition that comes out of Philadelphia that will get us very close to the origin of 5th and West Peachtree.